Hello and welcome to Ancient Jesus Future Faith. I'm Tana Sheaver and I'm here as usual with Sarah Minardi.
Hello.
And Don Sheaver.
Hey.
And today we're going to be talking about Genesis 3, what is typically referred to as the fall. It is the passage that is about the serpent coming and convincing Eve to eat of the fruit of the tree. And I wanted to start off by asking, what have you been typically taught about this passage? I think we all have a lot of different imagery about this passage, and I will actually start by saying that a lot of my understanding of this comes from a lot of the art and poetry that has been written about this. I did my critical history for my MA in English literature on Paradise Lost, which was so fun. And so a lot lot of my,
Didn't you choose that?
I did.
Just
They
checking.
should have stopped me. It was enormous. And yeah, anyway, it was a very poor choice. And, but a lot of, I realized through that a lot of my interpretation of this came from Milton and from, other, writers and artists and everything. And so it's this idea that the serpent is Satan, and Satan came and deceived, Eve, and then Eve kind of deceived or tempted Adam. And so my whole image of that was the fall of humanity. I was taught that we were inherently sinful because of that. And that is sort of when everything went poorly for humanity. I think that's my basic summary. Sarah, what about you?
Yeah, I think growing up, just this image of Adam and Eve in the garden with Satan and apples on the tree. And you did a much more accurate retelling of the story because there is no mention of Satan in the story. There's no mention of apples specifically, and
Right.
apples would not have grown in that part of the ancient Near East. And fun fact, that's like where you get the term Adam's apple, is that after like the collective decided that it was apples, that like Adam supposedly like choked on the apple. And that's like why you call it Adam's apple, if the Adam's apple.
Surprised they don't call it Eve's apple.
Yeah.
I had no idea.
I didn't know that either.
Yeah,
I have to rethink life now.
So yeah, a perfect example of thinking of a story and all these ideas and then looking at the text and realizing that it's not there, that these are interpretations or decisions that other people have placed upon the text. I have heard some teachings around holding Adam a little more accountable in the story in recent years, that his mistake was not, I don't know how they present it because I didn't ever delve too deeply into it, but I just know murmurings of that, trying to like look at it in a slightly different way of like that Adam, maybe that it's somehow his fault too. So I have heard some of that. Yeah. So that's pretty much what I came into understanding about this story.
Done?
Yeah, I think mine reflects both of yours. I don't necessarily have more to add. This is just a very commonly referenced, commonly told story in the Bible, which is why I'm interested in talking about it, because I think we could actually pull some other things out of this text than what, we all said that we've collectively come to have learned about it or what have you. So I'm excited for us to have a discussion around it. And I'd like to, if with your permission, to kind of walk the two of you through a reimagining of this passage. Now, with the two of you, you probably have some already insights into the text from different conversations we've had or of your own study. So feel free to add those as we go along. But yeah, so if that's all right with the two of you, that's what I'd like to.
Sounds good.
Yeah, I would love to reframe this.
Okay. Well, the first thing I want to do, and Tana, you started it, and
I started it.
yeah, and Sarah kind of added is would either of you be interested in kind of doing what we did with thinking through the baptism of Jesus? What are some of the imagery? What's some of the elements that are going on in this story of Genesis 3?
Well, I think first of all, the are you talking about imagery that's
serpent.
actually there, or imagery that we've been?
Sure, doesn't matter.
Well, the serpent. I always kind of picture the serpent curled up in the tree,
Yeah. I mean, there's a tree,
right?
there's a garden. The tree's been distinguished as the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. It's been set apart from other trees. There's fruit on the tree.
Right.
There was instruction from God about how to relate to that tree.
And then I guess the imagery, at least the beginning, would be Eve was alone with the tree and the serpent.
This led to the Franklin Graham, no,
Billy Graham?
Billy Graham rule for women not to be alone with serpents.
Right. The lesser known of
Yeah,
the Billy Graham
that's why it
rules.
was the Franklin Graham rule.
That's funny for so many reasons.
You're welcome.
Yeah, so there,
Yeah, and then if we want to go past the, so the nakedness, the idea of that things changed when they ate of the fruit,
oh, right.
and
When didn't they grab fig?
yeah, the covering covered themselves, and then God covers them after that with animal skin.
Yeah, it's the first death in the Bible.
Yes. Oh man, I was going to say that.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, but you're right.
Yeah.
Good job, Don.
Thanks.
Exactly where I was going.
And then I'm cheating a little because I'm looking at the verse. At the end, the cherubim and flaming sword guarding.
Oh yeah.
So getting kicked out, and then the angel with the sword guarding the garden.
And there's a river that goes out, or is that just a midrash? I can't remember if that's a midrash or that's in the text about a river flows from Eden. I remember reading a midrash about the river is a source of all the rivers, all the water in the world. But now I can't remember if the river actually appears in the text.
Doing a cursory look, and I don't see it, but
I don't think it appears here. I'm uncertain if it's somewhere else in Scripture, though. I know that we do have the river that flows out of the city of God in Revelation. So maybe there's some connection.
oh, I don't think we also mentioned God walking in the garden
Oh yeah.
as piece of the imagery,
Yeah,
which is very interesting.
sure. All right, so that's a great start, right? So we kind of already started to build out a little bit of the things that we see here. One of the things that I think is the most important piece, and you alluded to it, Sarah, that is actually not in chapter 3. It's the very last verse of chapter 2. And this again gets us where our decisions to split up the text sometimes robs us of some things,
Right.
right? But the very last verse of chapter 2, I see you looking there, Sarah. Do you mind reading it?
Sure. It says, both the man and his wife were naked, yet felt no shame.
Right. So in one of the Hebraic ways of reading text is you look for bookends. So it's the same idea repeated twice, and then you ask a question about what's contained in between. We've had conversations on this podcast before about the idea of Leviticus 18 and 20 bookending or being on both sides surrounding Leviticus 19. And Leviticus 19 then becomes extremely important for understanding Leviticus 18 and 20. So what is the other bookend? And this is what you alluded to, Sarah. So what's the other bookend for that?
That after they eat the fruit, they notice their nakedness and hide.
And hide, because now they feel shame. Mm-hmm. So we have one end that says they were naked and unashamed, and then we have another one where they were naked and ashamed and therefore hid. So for us, that leaves us with a really important question. What changed? What happened in between, right? And so we all know that what happened is what?
That ate the fruit.
Yeah, they ate from the tree. And so now we're left with, but what does that have to do with being naked? And to take it a step further, what does that have to do with sin when we think about this passage in terms of, and this made us sinful? Like,
Right.
why this moment? Like, what is it about sin that made them naked and ashamed? I think so. My personal thoughts is, if someone asking that question to a random group of people, they'd probably be like, well, it was lust. Well, they're husband and wife. Pretty sure that's
Right.
allowed.
Right.
Right. So what is it that they're naked and ashamed?
That's interesting, because I think if just reading like a very quote unquote simple reading, you would come to the conclusion like, oh, it must be evil for them to be naked. You know, because otherwise, why would they suddenly feel shame and cover themselves? Like, oh, now they know that it's evil and bad to be naked. That's
Yeah.
the
Good.
conclusion that feels like it would come from that.
I think that's closer than sin entered the world, right? That they deemed this as being wicked, right? But the thing is God's hanging out with them in the cool of the day, walking around the garden with them, and has not seemed to point out that this is a problem.
Right. And that's the thing that immediately popped into my mind after that, was that, oh, but if being naked was an evil, bad thing,
Then it wouldn't have existed
God
prior
wouldn't
to.
have, yeah.
Then if this is about sin, then it wouldn't have existed prior to eating from the tree. Do you see?
Right.
So we kind of get in some muddy territory right away.
Yeah.
Now, I'm going to do something here, and this is the way often. So when we talk through passages on this podcast and on our other platforms, understand, for me, this is a story. It's a myth to explain how humanity came about and how all things happen. I'm going to treat it with very generous gloves of it being historical when I'm talking about it, as if the things that were said are actually happened. So I'm going to approach it from that perspective. But I just want the listeners to understand that I don't personally hold that there was literally a Garden of Eden. And again, as I will often say, if I get to the world to come and Adam greets me with no belly button, I will tell him, my bad. I didn't see that.
But he'll have an Adam's apple.
He will. He will have still be choking. He'll have a
For eternity. That's his punishment. He chokes for eternity on this piece.
yeah. He'll have like a papyrus or a mango apple or something. I don't know. So first, I think the first thing that's important for us to do is, what are the two trees that are named?
The tree of the knowledge of good and evil.
And life.
And the tree of life. And they're told that they are allowed to eat from any tree they want, except for
the tree of the knowledge of good and evil.
Correct. So they're even able to eat from the tree of life, which I find to be really fascinating, and maybe is a whole nother conversation, because that means that the tree of life was something that they would have to eat from to maintain life. So anyhow, I think that's an interesting piece, right? So if I told you that I'm teaching a course on understanding what is good and what is bad. What would you think that course was about?
Ethics?
Interesting. Yeah. Ethics. What else?
Decision making?
Excellent. Anything else? Yeah, I think decision making, ethics, those are good. I noticed that you very clearly left out sin.
Oh.
Right? That you wouldn't go, oh, this is going to be a coursework on sin. And again, because that just doesn't logically line up. And so if all of a sudden you had the ability, the knowledge to determine what is good and what is evil, what would that make you?
All knowing?
I mean,
Or a judge?
a judge, right? So the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is this idea that now you can begin to judge what is good and what is evil. And it's not that it's a magic pill that's going to immediately make you the best judge. As we see clear here, how do we see that it's clear that they are not the best judge?
Because they judged that being naked was bad.
Right. Their first opportunity to do any kind of judging after eating from the tree, and they're like, oh, this isn't good. We're naked. And prior to it, the text is very clear to us that being naked was okay and they were unashamed when they were depending on what to be the judge?
God?
Yeah. So this idea of God walking with them, again, is very much imagery of parenting, teaching, guiding, right? If I said, I'm going to walk with you through these passages, right? I think I even used that phrase actually today unintentionally to say, I want to walk through this with you, right? Because I'm going to teach you, I'm going to hopefully shed light onto something that you weren't aware of. And so this idea of God walking in the garden with them was this idea that God was teaching them. Think about it this way. I mean, yes, when we picture Adam and Eve, we picture adults. But they're brand new to this world, right? Seemingly just days old at this moment, right? And think about, the weirdest, what were some of those movies where people changed age, like
Benjamin Button.
Freaky Friday, Benjamin Button. I don't know. I'm not familiar with Benjamin Button.
Benjamin Button is the aging in reverse thing.
Oh, I see. So yeah, I think you can make a case, but I think like Mork from Mork and Mindy also was old, but yeah, the baby. Never mind. That's really old.
Wow.
No, that is no longer pop culture. Anyhow, but also, what was the one with Tom Hanks? Big.
Oh, right.
Right? Mm-hmm. Where you have an adolescent in an adult's body.
Mm-hmm. Oh, 13 going on 30.
Oh, yeah.
So this is kind of, if we can, I'm already messing up all of Scripture by doing this, but if we can imagine this in that kind of sense, so what is it that we could imagine was God's intention with the garden?
Original intention?
It's like the teaching zone.
Yeah.
It's like, I just think of like little kids, like they come out of the womb and they don't really care about being naked. They don't really care about being naked until something informs them that they shouldn't be naked.
Right. So this is God saying, okay, don't touch the stove. It's hot. This is God saying, don't throw blocks in the living room, right? This is God giving instruction and walking with them in the cool of the garden. Because we know, what is the first command God gives Adam and Eve?
Be fruitful and multiply.
And?
Rule over.
Nope. You're absolutely right. Be fruitful, multiply, and? Fill the earth. So they were never intended to stay in the garden, right? The idea was always to leave the garden. Another piece we forget here, right? Is that
how can you fill the earth if you just stay in the garden?
Correct. And so the whole concept here going into this moment in Genesis 3 is that Adam and Eve know that their role in this world according to the way this story is being told, is to be fruitful, multiply, and fill the whole earth, not remain in the garden. But the garden is significant because the garden is where God walks with them. It is where God teaches them. Much like I have a 19-year-old child, Tana and I both have a 19-year-old child. It's the same one. It's the same child even. And right now, they are getting ready to go out into the world after being in our household and being taught by us and guided by us and informed by us. And in some way, you could argue there comes a moment that I would argue has already happened in his life where he does what? What transition happens in our relationship?
He becomes less dependent on us.
Yes. And why is he less dependent?
He's learning things. He has learned things.
We're getting there.
He's doing things on his own.
Think about why I'm asking the question for this story.
He understands how to judge things.
Yes, we've taught him how to judge well, hopefully.
Yeah.
And so there is a moment, and I think within Judaism, you would mark that probably bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah, at the time at which you're no longer dependent on your parents to be the judge. And in that idea, prior to a bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah, your parents are responsible for your mistakes. But then you demonstrate your own ability to judge and judge well. And you do that at your bar mitzvah or your bat mitzvah. And from that moment forward, you are responsible for your own actions because you have been deemed to know between good and evil. And so you now are the judge of your own life. You now get to go forward, go out, and live that. I would argue then, what is going on here? Well, I'm going to ask you that. I'm not going to argue it yet. So, so taking that into mind, if we find that to be plausible, I hope that seems plausible to you. Then what's the problem here? What are we seeing in Genesis 3?
It's almost like they grew up too fast. Like they weren't ready yet.
Yeah,
or they took it into their own hands.
Yeah, right? That I would actually propose that the tree of knowledge of good and evil was not going to be off limits forever. It was a graduation gift, kind of. Like, think about it in that terms, right? That at some point they would have demonstrated the ability to judge well in the same way that God judges. And in so doing, would be able to be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, and do it in a healthy and beautiful and meaningful way. However, they did like most kids do, and I did at least a dozen times. They decide that they know better, and they're going to run away, basically. I'm tired of living under the rules of this house. I want my freedom. And by the way, Mom, can you pack me a lunch so I don't get, right? And as soon as we get too hungry, we return back home type thinking, right? This is that moment, I would argue, in the text where Adam and Eve become convinced, right? Because what does the serpent say to Eve to convince her?
Did God really say?
Yeah. He's like, did God really say, and add something?
Now, this is the thing I've always thought was interesting, because doesn't he asks Eve, and she's like, don't eat it, but don't even touch it. But the serpent, in my mind anyway, is in the tree touching it.
Well, that's because that's a midrash.
Fine. Yeah, okay.
So God just says, don't eat it. The serpent says, don't eat or touch it. Mm-hmm. Didn't God tell you not to eat or touch the tree? And so then the rabbis imagined in midrash that the serpent says this while sitting in the tree next to the fruit, and therefore, obviously, give one truth and give one untruth.
Verse 2 and 3, the woman said to the serpent, we may eat fruit from the trees in the garden, but God did say, you must not eat fruit from the tree that is in the middle of the garden, and you must not touch it, or you will die.
Oh, you're correct. I'm sorry. I did apply that to the serpent as opposed to Eve, which implies then that Adam told Eve wrong.
Right.
Adam created what is called in Jewish minds, create a hedge around Torah. So a hedge around Torah is the idea that a very common hedge that I heard growing up in the church was, you shall not lust, therefore do not go to the mall on Friday nights, and do not remove yourself from situations where you might be around other people. And so a hedge is a secondary rule that's not in the Bible, a secondary rule that is not what God expects, that's meant to protect the original commandment.
Right.
And a real quick aside, rabbis said, the danger is we'll often build hedges so high that they ultimately fall and destroy the very thing they were meant to protect. And I think would argue that's what happens here, right? Adam seemingly has communicated to Eve, don't eat from the tree. In fact, don't even touch it. And as she approaches and sees the serpent in the tree, as Tana was alluding, along with the midrashes, that she was like, well, clearly that's not a problem. I think this is why a lot of young folks who grow up in faith, particularly the more closer to fundamentalism that faith is, they go to college and abandon that faith because they learn some things about biology, they learn some things about science that are basic things that their household bringing them up were so staunchly against. And they go, well, if this is true, and I was told it wasn't true, then
what else was I lied to about?
Correct. And so you just reject everything.
Right.
Which is a real danger that we've created. All right. So in this story now, we are told originally, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth. We are told they were naked and unashamed. The two trees are the tree of life and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. The very first thing they judge after they decide, no, we're tired of being told what to do, right? And the serpent says, what does the serpent say will happen if they eat from the tree?
No, you will not die. In fact, God knows that when you eat it, your eyes will be opened and you will be like God, knowing good and evil.
Right. Not you'll be like God and be sinful, right?
Right.
Like you'll be like God, being able to differentiate from good and evil. Look, just 1-2 chapters earlier, the darkness and the light were separated before there was sun and moon, which means the rabbis looked at that and said, that is the separation of good and evil. It is the first judgment that's being made. God is determining what is light and what is darkness. And it wasn't we turn on a light type thing, but instead it's this idea that God was separating what was good from what was evil. And this tree gives us permission to do it. It gives us the ability to take on that role, right? And so the serpent's trying to convince them with truth, well, God doesn't want you to eat from that tree because then you'll be like God. And I would argue, no, God doesn't want you to eat from that tree yet. Because when you do, it is your bar mitzvah, it's your bat mitzvah. You become responsible because you're declaring, I now know the difference between good and evil. So this is where you could make a case for sin coming into the picture here, right? Is that you judge poorly about what is good and what is evil, which means you miss the mark of what God desires for us, and missing the mark is the actual definition of the term sin in the Hebrew Bible.
Would missing the mark also be not obeying what God said?
Right. And so that becomes a fascinating thing. So they ultimately committed a sin before they ate from the tree. Right? Think about this. The very first sin here is not the crunch of the fruit. The very first sin is making up their mind to do it. Right?
Yeah.
And so if that's the case, I would argue it even identifies more with what I'm saying, because up until that moment, God was responsible for the sin of Adam and Eve as God was teaching them. And then once they take a bite of the tree, they now become responsible for it. Right? Is that all making sense so far?
Yeah.
That's really interesting, because that makes me think then, if God is responsible for Adam and Eve and that first sin, then God signing both sides of the covenant
With Abraham.
with Abraham. I keep wanting to say that was Genesis 18, but I think I always get that wrong.
No, it's Genesis 12 to 15.
Okay, thank you. Makes more sense. It makes more sense because God would be kind of accepting responsibility.
Yep.
Co-signing.
Yeah.
Right. So in this story now, I would argue, because the text doesn't say, and everything was perfect. Like, that's something we impose on the text, that prior from
Right.
eating from the tree, Adam and Eve were perfect humans. Well, that's nonsense.
Yeah.
And that's, I would even call it silly, right? And when we have the picture, we allow the language or the imagery of God walking with them in the garden, implying that God is teaching them, then that implies that they weren't perfect, because God wouldn't have to teach them.
Yeah.
In addition to that, if they were perfect, they would never consider the opportunity to defy God.
Yeah.
Right? Like, so there's all these pieces that when we really kind of sit down and flesh through them, they don't add up to the way that we've often read this. So they eat from the tree, and people will say the reason they're thrown out of the garden is they ate from the tree and therefore sinned against God, right? That's how I've often heard it taught. What does the text actually say is the reason for them being kicked out of the garden?
Then the Lord God said, "See, the man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil, and now he might reach out his hand and take also from the tree of life and eat and live forever. Therefore the Lord God sent him forth from the Garden of Eden to till the ground from which he was taken."
So how do you process that? And maybe by process that, I mean, how do you interpret that?
I've always had a difficult time processing that because the implication, like, it's strange to me, because the first thing they do is make a poor judgment, but then God is like, well, now they're just like us, which, does that imply God can make poor judgments then? I mean,
Okay.
I think of it as like adulting sucks, and like you don't want to be stuck being an adult forever.
That's right.
well, there's that too.
I want a reset button.
Yeah, because like when you're a kid, I mean, kids tend to think they want to be adults.
Right.
And adulting doesn't.
Don't do it, kids.
Yeah, doesn't
Wait, no.
completely suck. Not all adulting, but you know, it's like hard to like. It feels like as a mom to carry the weight of the world on my shoulders, and if I liken that to like, do I really want to like live forever, like with this weight on my shoulders? And I mean, yes, I want to live as long as possible because I love my kids and my husband and my friends, but yeah, it's like living forever seems like a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. It feels like the older I get, the more, baggage I'm carrying, and the more poor choices I've made that I have to live with, and, all of that stuff. And that's also what I think of when I think about this part about, after Adam and Eve ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, God was like, okay, don't let them eat from the tree of life. And I'm like, yeah, don't, because that would just be, that would be horrible. I feel like there's just way too much stuff that would build up over time.
Yeah.
So this is where I would say I make a shift back to reading it as metaphor. Mm-hmm. And, listeners and you, the two of you, can call that convenient if you want, and that's fine. And the reason I think it's metaphor, and honestly, I think treating the entire thing as a metaphor doesn't break down. It's just that the language I used holds it accountable in a more historical way by like, what was the first command? What was this? that's why I mentioned that. But in this metaphor, what I would argue is they now have stolen the role of judge from God. Because up until this moment, God was judge. God was the one telling them what was good, what was evil. God was the one directing them, teaching them, explaining to them, sharing with them, helping them to see the world through the lens of God. But they prematurely, without God's permission, stole the role of God, a role of judge from God. And then, of course, the text is humorous here by pointing out that the very first judgment they made was wrong.
Right.
And it was bad. It was bad judgment. And God is looking at them and saying, now that they've taken the role of judge and they become more like us, let's get them out of here before they eat from the tree of life. And I think the argument here is you're a bad judge, and you living forever as a bad judge is not good for anyone. Right? So it goes along similar to what you guys were saying. And it's this picture of like, this is not healthy. And I think what's really significant and beautiful here is that the more we read through the text, the longer we spend time in the text, what does it seem like God is always attempting to do?
Save us from ourselves.
Okay.
Protect us.
Okay. More simply put, and I think you guys would both get there, but it would become obnoxiously long time of me saying, okay, and God is trying to return his judge the entire time, right? It's not long after this that we get Torah. We find out that God has commands for the way for us to live, for the way for us to engage. And God is saying, I want to give you these to help you continue to learn and become better judges, right? And we see it in the text constantly of God. God's more concerned about judges being set up in Israel than kings being set up in Israel, right?
Right. Yeah.
The whole text is about, we need you to judge. We need you to judge well. Moses gets condemned by his pagan father-in-law because he's not judging properly. And the father-in-law comes around and says, do you really think you should be doing this by yourself? Like that seems wrong. Like you should probably have other people. Do you imagine that's what God wants you to be doing, is judging all the people yourself? And so then Moses takes that advice or rebuke and starts placing judges over groups of people. And this becomes part of Israel's story. And God desires for them to have judges, not kings.
Right.
And I think part of the danger that we have when we eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil too early in life, we start to act like kings instead of judges. Right? And think about where the text talks about do not judge one another, right? If you judge someone, judge them with mercy and compassion, right? If you meet someone struggling in poverty, don't judge their situation, but sit open-handed. Like all of the language of the text is God constantly telling Israel how to be better judges. So how does this begin, if any way, to start to reshape the way you might think about this passage or just rethink this in general?
Well, it just makes me think of parenting, because parenting as a king would be like my way or the highway, or because I said so, those kind of phrases. And parenting as a judge is more helping the child to understand at their level the why, when appropriate, that you're making decisions because you're trying to walk along with them and protect them and provide for them and use your knowledge of things that they may not have thought about.
Absolutely.
So that was the parallel that popped in my mind when you were talking about judge versus king.
Yeah.
Well, and that's interesting too, because that role of judge, that way of viewing a judge, is more like guidance, and love than I think we would typically think of a judge now. I think we think of judges as people who, in a lot of cases, mete out punishment. They determine whether or not someone did something wrong, and then if they did, what level of punishment they deserve. And in our criminal justice system, I think we would say a lot of them do that poorly. Or we think about judgment in terms of, in more individual terms, of us judging each other, and that's always seen as a negative as well. Like we're, oh, don't be so judgmental is never like, don't be so judgmental and tell me I'm beautiful. It's a negative, right? And this role of judge feels more like teacher.
Yes.
Which is very interesting to me because I don't think we typically think of it that way.
Yeah. And don't be a judge. I definitely have that negative connotation of like, don't judge others. But also if we never speak up, I think of like, I'm always very hesitant to like complain about things when I'm at a restaurant or correct things. And even though logically in my mind, I'm like, well, if I own this restaurant, I would want to know what people think, even when it's negative, and so that I could grow. But I realize that like not everybody has that kind of like growth ideal, and I don't want to hurt people's feelings, and I just stay quiet. But yeah, so there's like that judge or that critique that helps the world grow that isn't negative. But there is so much negative connotation around judging or critiquing that often I feel bad about myself because just the way I'm wired, I just see so many things in the world and I have so many opinions and critiques. And I don't even want to say that on this podcast because it's like, now I feel like I'm labeled as a critical person. But why is that a bad thing? Because I think I have some things to offer that could give somebody a different perspective. Yeah. But I don't feel safe sharing it like 70% of the time.
But that's even kind of a sad part of how we've come to view judgment, because I value your judgment, right? And so if there was something, some behavior I was engaging in that you think is destructive in some way, I'd prefer if you didn't point it out on the podcast.
Well, I was waiting to tell you. No.
But if you were to come to me in private and say, I think, et cetera, I would value that. I think depending on my mood and the moment and everything, I might in the moment be like, all right, Sarah. Yeah. But once I got over that initial, hurt or insult or whatever, I would carefully consider your words. And I think that's kind of a sad thing that we've lost as well, because there are so many of us that are so quick to judge in rude ways, right? And it's just insulting, but so that we've lost the good judge.
Well, and I think also part of this is, if you're thinking about this in terms of an actual judge, powdered wig and all, if you want, right? That judge isn't walking around the city just randomly making judgments.
Right.
They are in a space in which someone approaches them and says, here's what's going on, and I value your insight.
Yes.
Right? So I think there's a difference between unasked for judgment and judgment in a setting. I think part of the places that we also fail is a willingness to ask the people around us, did I do this well?
Yeah.
Did the way that I went about this, was any suggestions, any thoughts on the way I could do it better? Any concerns about the way I'm XYZ, right? I think that's, we don't have that in us very well. And I think it's such an important thing for us to be able to walk up to one another and say, Sarah, am I approaching this? Am I sharing X, Y, and Z enough? Whatever, give me feedback. And it's interesting because oftentimes when you do that, people are like, no, I think it's fine.
Well, yeah, because you're afraid to hurt someone's feelings.
Of course.
Yeah. And I'm getting a little emotional.
I know, I could tell. I didn't know
Yeah.
whether I was allowed to say anything or not.
No, I'm getting a little emotional about this because this is something that's been on my mind. I implicated earlier, like the older I get, the more bad decisions I have to live with. And I've been finding that, oh my gosh, I'm getting so emotional. I've been finding that a little unbearable lately.
Yeah.
Because I know I've hurt people
Yeah.
in the past. And I suspect I may have hurt fewer people if some trusted person would have said to me at some point, this behavior is harming others. Now, I don't mean to say that as a way of that feels like then I'm not taking like, why didn't somebody tell me? It's all your fault, guys. I don't mean that, but I just wonder how long I was allowed to harm people before someone was finally like, that's not cool.
Yeah.
And so I it is sad to me that I think a lot of our relationships don't allow for that level of judgment / teacher.
Yeah. I think it's interesting. I say to people all the time, and I think they believe, sometimes I say it in jest just because it's become a thing, but in our community, but I will often create space in which someone has the freedom to push back on me or say something to me, and I'll say, I accept your rebuke. Yeah. And I don't view that as a negative. I'm grateful that I have community around me that's willing to hold me accountable, hold me to higher standards, hold me to something better. And it's so funny when you say, I accept your rebuke, people are like, no, I wasn't rebuking you. And it's like, no, literally you did. So yes, you rebuked me, and I'm okay with it. In fact, I welcome it. I want to be rebuked.
And this just, to me, speaks to the problem in general about approaching difficult biblical texts, because if we don't have safe places where we can talk about difficult topics, then we just take what we've been told and we just keep repeating it. And
we don't have practice rooms, as you referenced several podcasts ago.
Yeah. To be a place to go to be able to bring up these topics where you're not going to feel judged for whatever viewpoint you have coming in, but it's also going to be a place where other viewpoints can be shared and we can exist in the same space and hold different viewpoints.
Yep.
But it's almost like we're so scared of being influenced, which I think is probably a lot of the pounding of the pulpit of beware of false teachers, that we can't even have like discussions. There's so much fear of being judged and fear of opening up. I mean, I don't know what our demographic of our listeners is at this early stage of the
all
podcast.
All of our moms. Okay, yes, 2 out of 3 of our moms. My mom is not listening.
But I think that even listening to a podcast like this, depending where you are, could be very difficult.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because not being used to exploring the Bible in this way can feel heretical or dangerous or all of these things. And it can be hard to like put your finger on that or where that comes from. But it just reminds me of this topic of judging and not being safe to discuss these things.
Yeah.
As opposed to just being like, okay, you're another human being who is saying something different than what I've heard before. So maybe I start looking into this a little bit more than, and where did I get my ideas, which is sometimes very hard to track down.
Yes.
And why am I holding on to them so tightly? I remember a phrase that one of my mentors used to say a lot was, when you're feeling like those kind of bubbling up of feelings and emotions, that a helpful question is, what does my reaction teach me about me?
Yeah.
So
that's great.
It's like you're in this space, somebody says something and it ruffles your feathers, or like you start to feel feelings because maybe even something we said on this podcast has been like, oh no, like just brings up those feelings. But pausing and say, okay, what does my reaction teach me about me?
Yeah.
And why am I having this reaction to this? And where did I get my ideas? And then starting on that path and that journey, because a different person could be listening to the podcast and their feathers are not ruffled.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that you mentioned there triggered a thought. So there's this rabbinic concept that just like flowers, no matter where they grow, no matter what soil they come out of, what trash heap they come out of, we've all seen photos of a beautiful flower growing up out of a dump, right?
Yeah.
That regardless, they all have to bend towards the sun. And we're just called to be bent towards the sun. That is our goal as being faithful people, is that we bend towards the sun for sustenance. And so the soil we're growing in is circumstances oftentimes beyond our control. And the only thing that is in our control, to beat the dead horse, is to be bent towards the sun. And I
And
love
the sun being God, right? Not being the sun god.
not being the sun god, not Ra, and not S01 either. Don't turn this into a Jesus thing.
Yeah.
So it's this kind of beautiful idea that we can sit around the table, share ideas about ways to read the text. And the only thing that we need to do in order to evaluate the healthiness of this is, are we all bent towards the sun right now? Is the goal to be bent towards God? And if it is, even if there is something misguided in the way we're understanding it, that we should be careful and withhold harsh judgment on people because they're striving to be bent towards God. And we should encourage that. And we should recognize that that's going to look different depending on the soil you're in, the conditions in which you grew out of. I know for me, this journey, growing up in a fundamentalist household that was abusive, that my father was the pastor, this was a completely different process than the two of you who shared on this podcast a few times that you grew up in a Catholic background,
Right.
and at different times in your lives changed over to a Protestant perspective. And so I guarantee you that we didn't bend towards the sun the same way, right? We didn't get here in the exact same journey, and we need to make sure that that's the value we give other people. And I think that brings us full circle back to this passage, is that God desires for us, when we take on the role of judge, to do it well. Because when you don't, it leads to death. And I think that that's powerful, right? I think that for many of us, we've all experienced someone else's poor judgment leading to the feelings of death and harm about you're not good enough, or even our own bad judgments about ourselves and the lies that we allowed to play. And I think this for Israel was Israel's way of understanding, how did we end up broken? How did we end up so hurting and hurting others? And I think this story resonated with them because they go, we became judges too young.
Yeah.
And our job is to do the best we can to return the role of judge to God. And we see that language constantly throughout the text. Even the book of Revelation in some way imagines that God will return and be the rightful judge. Jesus will be the rightful judge over all the peoples, right? And instead, our churches, our pastors tend to be setting up kings instead of judges. And I can't help but to go back to what you said, Sarah, about, the because I said so mindset that we is easiest to do, right? Like, I've had some exhausting days when Malcolm was little, and, we did our best to try and explain and articulate concepts and
let
ideas.
him ask questions.
Yeah, but there were definitely days where I'm just like, look at him and be like, Malcolm, today it's because I said so. And you might have a really valid point to want to discuss this, but not today, son.
But his response, one of the first, the first time one of us said that to him was,
Don't say one of us, it was you.
I'm pretty sure it was you. I was trying to be nice by
No, I'm
saying,
pretty sure it was you.
but one of us said, well, because I said so. And Malcolm was like, is that a good reason for you? Because that's not a good reason for me.
Yeah, he was like 5.
amazing.
He was like 4 or 5, and you're just like, look, I do not have time for your insight. So the one last thing I want to say here, because we're getting close to time, is another thing that I had heard about this passage time and time and time again, is that we were thrown out of the garden because we became less of something. Right? And so this was because we were no longer perfect. This was because the relationship with us and God was broken. This was because of all these things. But that is not what the text says. The text says because you've become more like us. You become more like God. That the time of learning in this way is gone. Right?
Yeah.
I think it's the same way as when our child moves out, the way that they learn from us is different. That the safety of the garden for learning is gone. And I think that this is what this text is about. I think this is how Israel was understanding why it was so important to continue to study, to learn, to grow in their understanding of God, to practice the laws of Israel. And because of that, they could continue to grow as judges. It's just now it's different. There's no longer that sanctuary that you have as a child. And to me, I think this is actually beautiful. And, you know, maybe on another episode or something, we'll discuss some of like the curses and stuff that are in there that I also don't think go against this. I think we can kind of view it. In fact, one of my favorite approaches to one of the curses, so just to give a teaser for what we may or may not ever get to, is God is hurt. Like God's hurt. And God basically says, in the same way that I experienced pain of birthing you out into the world, you're going to understand the pain of childbirth too. Because this, in my opinion, and Sarah, you mentioned it before, this is a birthing narrative. And the child is about to break out of the womb. And this is a premature birth. And God is saying, I have suffered and I have felt great pain. But it's birthing time, right?
Yeah.
It's a terrible catchphrase.
It's birthing time.
It's birthing time.
Check out our merch store.
Well, Sarah, do you have any final thoughts to share before we sign off for today?
Well, just a couple things. I mean, I think we need to, we've talked about the name that it's referred to as the fall. So I feel like this one needs a rebranding too.
It's birthing time.
Yeah.
The new pericope by Ancient Jesus Future Faith.
God as an empty nester.
Yeah. And then the other thing is that, yeah, when we get to the curses, I think that it would be smart not to build a theology out of a curse. Kind of on the topic of genre or like subgenres or things like that, that a lot gets taken out of those curses and applied to women. And I think that we should think twice about that.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more.
That's fantastic. And I assume you had already said your final thing, right, Don? I'm not stepping over.
Go for it.
Okay.
I mean, I'm always prepared to add.
I think the thing I would hope people would take away from this is that we are all imperfect judges. And so I think we need to keep that in mind for ourselves and for each other and show grace to both.
You know what? I do have something to add. And it goes wonderfully with what you said. I couldn't agree more. And I love that in the Hebrew, as I have been taught, that term for judging implies that you are giving benefit of the doubt.
Right.
Oh.
Yeah.
That because it's used for monetary things. So like if you purchase someone from someone, that judging is the scales, right? We see it in our justice system with the scales, but those scales are monetary. And that if you are the person purchasing something, you make sure that you give more than what was asked, just in case. Because again, theirs was by measurement. So if the scale was off, you always made sure that it benefited the other person. If you are the one selling, you always made sure that you gave extra. It's why, they throw extra French fries in the bag at Five Guys, because they judge properly. So
Today's episode is sponsored by.
oh, that would be fantastic. That'd be fantastic. So, but I just think that that's to what you were saying about judging and receiving it and giving it, is that always make sure you remember that piece, that when we judge, that we should be giving the other the benefit of the doubt.
Love it. I love it. Well, thank you for joining us today, and we hope you'll join us next time. In the meantime, you can find us on Twitch on Mondays and Thursdays at 8 p.m. Eastern, at our website, ancientjesusfuturefaith.com, and check us out on social. You can find us. Thanks, and we'll see you next time.
Bye.
Bye.